My name is Jeremy Manning, and I'm an assistant professor of psychological and brain sciences at Dartmouth College. I'm thrilled to be part of this NIMH workshop on naturalistic stimuli and individual differences. Today, I'd like to tell you about my lab's work on understanding the shapes and other geometric properties of real-world learning and memory. A really useful tool that my lab uses for thinking about real-world learning and memory is a geometric space I like to call a thought space. If you're familiar with text embedding models, thought spaces are the geometric spaces that text is embedded in. The idea is that each point in these spaces represents some thought or set of thoughts that we could have, and points that are nearby in Euclidean distance represent thoughts that are semantically or conceptually related. For example, duck and goose live near each other in this space, but duck and truck live far apart. To help illustrate what these spaces look like in practice, here I've embedded the text of several thousand NeurIPS articles. Each article is a dot, and the colors denote human annotated labels that describe what the articles are about. We can see that dots of the same color often clump together, which means this approach is picking up on similarities in the content of the articles. By rotating the view of this space, you can really start to get a sense of its full 3D structure. One interesting observation is that even though in principle these articles could land anywhere in this rectangular prism, in practice, the articles end up lying on the surface of this nicely structured manifold. You could even imagine creating a classifier for guessing whether some new document fit with this set by asking whether it got embedded onto the surface of the same shape. Whereas the content of a document is kind of like a fixed point in this space, our thoughts are constantly changing. Maybe the thoughts you're having at one particular moment could be placed somewhere in this space. But as your thoughts change over time, they trace out a thought trajectory like this one. The shapes of thought trajectories tell us about the dynamics of thought. By thinking about thoughts as these geometric shapes, it opens up all sorts of interesting opportunities for using tools from the field of geometry to test deep theories about cognition. For example, remembering something that happened earlier means that we're revisiting old thoughts. Geometrically, that looks like a loop in your thought trajectory. So the loopiness of your thought trajectory tells us something about how much remembering you might be doing during a particular interval. I should also note that even though I'm drawing thought spaces as three-dimensional to make them easy to visualize, when we actually build these models in the lab, they're typically much higher dimensional, but we can still project them onto low-dimensional spaces to gain visual insights and intuitions into how they look. Here are some real thought trajectories from people listening to a story. Each colored line in this animation is for a different person. You can really start to see in this example how powerful this framework can be. For example, you can see that there are certain parts of the story where everyone's thoughts seem to deflect. Maybe those correspond to changes in the narrative arc. Or even though people's thoughts tend to change together, we can see that they're not identical. So we could ask at each moment, how spread out are different people's thoughts? Or are the moments when everyone's thoughts are especially similar, particularly engaging parts of the story? Or when people's thoughts diverge, are those particularly abstract parts of the story? We can also look at individual differences. For example, when one person's thoughts diverge from the group, can we explain that as some property of the person or the story or some interaction between the person and story? Thought trajectories turn these high-level questions about the dynamics of thoughts into specific hypotheses that we can test using geometric tools for comparing and characterizing shapes. Here's another example of how we can gain insights into cognition using thought trajectories. This example comes from a dataset collected by Janice Chen. The participants in this experiment watched a 50-minute episode of the BBC television show Sherlock while fMRI data were collected. And then, after they finished watching the episode, they verbally recalled what had happened. What I'm showing on the left is the thought trajectory that reflects how the episode unfolds over time. That was created by fitting a text embedding model to a set of detailed descriptions that a group of research assistants made by painstakingly annotating what was happening in each camera shot in the episode. The red dots correspond to the beginning of the episode, and the colors fade to blue as time progresses. There's some additional processing that happens here to segment these trajectories into discrete events and project everything onto a 2D plane. But the way to think about the trajectory on the left is that it tells us what happened in the episode, and each dot is one narrative event. The trajectory on the right shows how people talked about what happened in the episode when they remembered it later. There's no brain data here. This is made just using a dynamic text embedding model to fit transcripts of people's verbal recalls. Again, there's some pre-processing happening here to segment the trajectories into discrete events and then project them into the same thought space as the trajectory on the left. One thing that stands out to me is that the shapes on the left and right look really similar. That immediately tells us that people are remembering the episode pretty well. We can also look at agreement across people. The arrow directions show the average directions that different people's recall trajectories progressed, given that they passed through that part of thought space. The bluer and longer arrows denote when we saw reliable agreement across people. You can see that the arrows form a sort of current that follows the shape of the recall trajectory, which means that people tended to describe what happened in the episode in similar ways. On one hand, it's not super surprising that different people who watched the same television episode could remember what happened well, or that they described what happened in the episode similarly to each other. But if you think about what our approach needs to be capturing in order to find this pattern, it's pretty neat. Different people used totally different words and spoke for different amounts of time when they verbalized their memories. And further, the ways they actually experience the episode through their senses as a sequence of sights and sounds needed to be translated into spoken language independently by each participant. But this geometric approach to looking at what they said allows us to focus in on the underlying conceptual content. It allows us to compare and contrast different people's memories of this shared experience and to compare those rememberings to the original experience. We can actually zoom in even further by visualizing the way each individual participant recounted the episode. What happens is that visually, we can see that everyone's trajectory has a similar course scale shape, but what varies across people is how many dots or events each person's recounting contains. Some people just touch on a few key events and others go into a lot of detail. Geometrically, the level of detail appears as fine scale spatial structure in these trajectories. One way of understanding that fine scale structure is to attempt to quantify how closely the way someone recounts a particular event matches what happened during that event in the original episode. For example, what I'm calling precision here is computed as the correlation between the text embedding vector of each recounted event and the embedding vector of the event in the episode that matched most closely. So high correlations mean you're getting back the nuanced blend of meanings from the original event, and a low correlation means you're missing some of the detail. If we take an example event, on the bottom left, we can color an annotator's description of what happened in this example scene. And then on the bottom right, I'm showing examples of how two participants recounted that event. The recounted sentences are colored according to which parts of the annotations they matched most closely. The upper participant, P17, is recounting a wide range of the colors from the annotations. This means that they're recalling what happened very precisely. But the bottom participant, P6, just recounted 5 basic things about the entire event. So they're remembering correctly, but not in a particularly detailed way. Another way of looking at the fine-scale structure of memory is to use a measure we call distinctiveness. This characterizes how the way someone recounts a given event includes information specific to that event over and above generic information that could also apply to other events. On the bottom left, I've colored different annotated events, each in a different color. On the bottom right, I'm showing the way 2 example participants recounted the purple event, event 21. Each sentence they recall is colored according to the event it most closely matches. The way the upper participant, P9, talks about event 21 is highly focused on that specific event. We also see a little bit of orange, pink, and blue, which correspond to very nearby events in the episode. But the way the lower participant, P6, talks about event 21 draws in information about a wide range of other events from the episode. In addition to purple, we see lots of yellows and greens, which correspond to faraway events. So even though everyone in this study did a reasonably good job at describing what happened, when we dug into the specifics of how they recounted what happened and how it related to other happenings in the episode, that's where people start to differ. Another interesting insight we get from this approach relates to where we go mentally when we remember a past event. In other words, if you think about how you spread your thoughts back to each moment along the timeline of your past, what does that distribution look like? We can use text embeddings to explore which moments in this episode people describe or recollect similarly. In other words, we can look at how correlated the text embeddings are between different moments or events. If we look at text embeddings of the way annotators describe a given event, we almost always see a single peak in those correlations. It means that each event reflects an essentially unique blend of conceptual content, modulo things that happen just before or just after. But when we look at how people recollect that same event, we see a much different pattern. Here, each colored line corresponds to a single participant, and the black line denotes the average across people. When people recollect the same reference event shown by the gray line, we see a peak around the same moments, but we also see other peaks around other parts of the episode. In other words, when people talk about this particular moment, they're bringing in details gleaned from other parts of the episode. We can understand what's going on if we identify the peaks in this function. And then we can take a look at what happened in the episode during those moments. The reference event people are remembering here is a scene where the 2 main characters, Sherlock Holmes and John Watson, are bantering with each other in their apartment, when suddenly they're interrupted when Sherlock sees a police car pass by the window and realizes that another suspicious death has occurred. At the time, we think someone has committed suicide, and later on we learn that the suicides are actually murders. When people talk about that scene later, they bring in information from other scenes involving Sherlock and John bantering with or about each other, and also other murders by the same killer. They even bring in information about events that occurred after this reference event that they couldn't have known about at the time the reference event happened. People seem to infuse their memories about what happened in their past with flavors from other relevant events and experiences they had prior to the time of remembering, even if those experiences occurred after the remembered moment. When we use thought trajectories and text embedding models to describe the dynamic content of complex naturalistic stimuli, we gain new ways of testing hypotheses and characterizing behaviors and cognitive phenomena like learning and memory. In the examples I showed you, we saw that every participant in the Sherlock experiment remembered the fundamental narrative. Geometrically, that was captured by the low spatial frequency details of the trajectories. And we also saw that participants differed substantially in how they remembered the low-level details of specific parts of the episode. Geometrically, that was captured by high spatial frequency details of the trajectories. And then when we drilled into the spread function of those trajectories, we got to see how people combine their experiences when they describe their past. I hope that these examples have given you a taste of some of the ways we can use thought spaces to model thought dynamics. and also to compare different thought trajectories geometrically and use those geometric comparisons to test cognitive theories. What I want to show you next is some of my newer work on extending these ideas. Like most work in cognitive neuroscience, the studies I've told you about so far primarily rely on post hoc analyses. In other words, once we've collected the data, we can mine it for patterns and then use statistical tests to estimate how well they matched our theories or models. But an even stronger approach to hypothesis testing is to causally manipulate someone's experience in a way that your theory predicts will impact their cognition. Then you can test whether their behavior or brain activity was changed in the way your theory predicted. A research area I'm becoming increasingly interested in as a test bed for these ideas is in optimizing how people learn and acquire knowledge. In the science fiction world, technology-enhanced learning looks something like this.
I know Kung Fu.
Show me.
So in the world of the Matrix, you just download the information you want to know directly into your brain, hard drive style, and then suddenly you know Kung Fu or how to fly a helicopter. In the real world, though, learning is a bit harder. And I view this not just as a research problem, but as a societal challenge that we will need to solve as a species. Back in the day, getting a PhD in chemistry meant that you had learned to a sufficiently good approximation all of humanity's collective knowledge about chemistry, and that you had perhaps even expanded on that pool of knowledge with a new discovery. Today, getting a PhD in chemistry often means learning about a single molecule. And it's not that we're lazier or dumber today than we were back then. If anything, global pandemic notwithstanding, we're way more productive than we've ever been before. But humanity's knowledge pool has been growing at an accelerating rate as new discoveries leverage older discoveries. That means that our ability to acquire a fixed fraction of humanity's total knowledge is getting harder and harder over time. As an interdisciplinary scientist, that's distressing because it means that deep expertise across many domains is going to become increasingly rare. But it's also becoming increasingly more important that we keep up with humanity's knowledge pool if we, as individuals, are going to have any hope of understanding the new discoveries we make. I think what we need is a new way of learning. Imagine that you could learn a totally new language in just a few hours, or memorize a textbook's worth of information, or learn an entire undergraduate degree's worth of information, or learn a doctorate's worth of information, all in just a few hours. I'm not saying I have the time scale exactly right here, but I'd like you to think about how the ability to absorb and understand much, much more quickly than you can now would change your life. What could you discover? What could you accomplish? To get us closer to that matrix view of learning, what sorts of challenges are we going to face? Well, I'd argue that we first need to understand what the limiting factors of learning are. Like, what's holding us back? Next, I think we're going to need explicit models of what our learning goals are. In other words, we need some way of quantifying our learning goals and of understanding how different stimuli or ways of communicating information might relate to those goals. I think we also need ways of representing and tracking what people already know and what they're ready to learn next. For example, it might not make sense to teach you about algebra if you don't yet know what addition is. And finally, we'll need a way of choosing how to present the to-be-learned information to the learner, ideally in a customized or optimized way. I'd like to give you a little preview of how my lab is approaching a few of these challenges. One area we've been exploring is how well different text embedding models can capture the conceptual content of online course videos. As an example, here we've embedded the transcripts of 4,000 course videos from Khan Academy. Each dot is a video, and the dot colors denote the human annotated subject areas. You can see that dots of the same color clumped together, which is a nice sanity check that this approach is capturing something meaningful about course content. We can also model how the content of a single course video changes over time. Here I'm showing a trajectory for one video that's constructed by treating each sliding window of its transcript as a document and then connecting the embeddings of each sliding window. If I were to ask you conceptual questions about the content of this video, I could also plot the embeddings of the text of each question in this same space. Here, each question is a dot, where green denotes a correct response and red denotes an incorrect response to the question. In a typical class setup, I might conclude that the student here knows about 80% of the material since they answered 4 questions correctly and 1 question incorrectly. But when we factor in the conceptual content of the course and each question, we can get a much more nuanced view. For example, for each moment of the course, we can compute the weighted average proportion of questions the student answered correctly, where the weights are given by how much each question's content overlaps with the content from that moment of the course lecture. The dotted blue line shows the reconstructed course performance, where the blue line overlaps with the black course trajectory during parts of the lecture where the student answered questions correctly, and it gets rounded towards the origin when the student answered fewer questions correctly. It gives us a detailed time course of how much the student is taking away from each moment of the lecture. We're also developing a brain-based version of this idea, where we predict moment-by-moment learning and attention using EEG data that we record during learning. That gives us a way of estimating these learning trajectories without any apparent user input, other than just watching course video snippets and watching how their brains respond. Here's a schematic of how the full thing works. In the upper left, we start by defining a learning goal. In the cartoon, we're looking at a 2D projection of thought space, and the circles define a grid of concepts that we have learning materials for in the full knowledge pool. The black line represents the trajectory of a course lecture, which can be a convenient way of defining a learning goal. And then I've colored the concepts that are close to the learning goal in green and everything else red. The idea is that we want the learner to know about the concepts marked by the green dots, and we don't care if they know about the concepts marked by the red dots. Next, we'll use an initial set of quiz questions and/or brain recordings to estimate what the student already knows. To use the same trick I showed you on the previous slide, we can estimate the knowledge about any arbitrary concept by taking a weighted average of their question performance, where the weights reflect how close the question's coordinates are to that concept's coordinate in thought space. That gives us a continuous and smooth map of the student's current state of knowledge. In the cartoon in the upper right, I've colored circles in green where the estimated knowledge has passed some threshold value, and red where the estimated knowledge hasn't yet met that threshold. We can also estimate learnability by looking at changes in the knowledge map over time. Areas where the student has tended to gain knowledge more readily are shaded lighter, and areas where the student has tended to learn more slowly are shaded darker. Next, as shown in the lower left, we can order all of the material in our knowledge pool according to its expected change in knowledge in the direction of the learning goal. For example, we use hidden Markov models to segment each course video into discrete conceptual snippets and map each snippet onto a coordinate in thought space. After filtering out snippets whose learning dependencies haven't been met yet, we can use the estimated current knowledge and learning maps to rank those snippets according to how much we expect they'll further the student's learning goal. Then we display that next snippet to the learner, update our estimates of their knowledge and learning maps, and repeat the cycle either until a time limit is reached or until their learning goal has been achieved. The idea is to show the learner exactly what they need to know at exactly the moment they need to know it. Something I'm really excited about is the potential to put this into real classrooms to help make learning easier, more accessible, and more efficient for students around the world. I think this can be done relatively cheaply for around the price of a few dozen textbooks. The systems my lab is working on use a 3D printed EEG headset, a cheap Raspberry Pi computer, and a cheap touchscreen for interacting with the content. I see this line of work on optimizing learning as part of a much broader question space about how we send and receive information to each other when we communicate. We could use thought space models to quantify the conceptual content of our conversations. The alignment between how much my thought space is aligned with your thought space around the locations in thought space we're communicating could tell us about how effectively we could communicate about those concepts. And by mapping problems about conversation onto these geometric thought spaces, we can start to use the sorts of mathematical machinery we know and love to optimize communication. We can also start to explore bandwidth limitations of human communication and to explore how we might surpass our natural limits using technologies like augmented reality and virtual reality to enhance our abilities. I think augmented cognition is the next great frontier of human knowledge expansion, and I'm excited to keep pushing the limits of how people communicate and think. Thanks so much for your attention. I'd also like to thank the members of my lab, as well as the funding agencies that supported the work I've told you about today. Looking forward to speaking with you during the discussion panel for this workshop in September.